about archaeology, but today we did miss a week of the New Testament when I got so sick, but I think you already probably know, Mark was written in the Roman period, and there's beautiful stories to the Gospel of Mark and James and that kind of thing. But we had a whole class on James like a year ago, but I'll take a poll. Like, if you want me to do the missing New Testament class next week, I can. But if you want a lot of time to ask the questions that you've been thinking about, or that this class has prompted for you, I will be happy to spend time on those as well. So give me your votes after class, because I'm not posting one on social media because I hate it. It's a trash can. But yes, in any case, we are, in terms of moving backwards, we run out of books of the Bible today, because we're going to be talking about the occasion of the Pentateuch. And of course, since we are taking traditional authorship for granted for the purposes of this class, that puts us in the days of Moses. And the most obvious occasion for the Pentateuch is the occasion of the Exodus. We talked a lot a couple of years ago when we did kind of an outline of what the Bronze Age was like in Genesis through Joshua. We talked a little bit about the world as it was at the time of Moses, but I want to remind you of the actual occasion in a little more detail. And the occasion is kind of summed up in one part of Genesis 15. Then he said to Avram, "Understand that your offspring will be sojourner in a land not theirs, and they will serve them, and they will oppress them 400 years. But also the people whom they serve, whom Abram's offspring serve, I'm judging. And afterwards they come out with great profit. Now you go to your fathers in peace, buried with good gray hair, and in the 4th generation they return here." Because Abraham was sent to Canaan. God was having this conversation with Abram in Canaan. "Because the sin of the Amorite is not full at this point." It had been, perhaps for many people who were alive in New Kingdom Egypt that called themselves Israelites, this may have been a forgotten moment to some extent. But long beforehand, there had been a moment that was destined to come, that was predicted and prophesied to come between God and Abram, that Abraham's descendants were going to come back to Canaan. And this is not going to be a class about the date of the Exodus, but we will talk in just a moment a little bit about the big window of the Pentateuch, regardless of when you date the Exodus. But probably over about 550 years or so-ish, I hate math, have passed between that conversation between God and Abram and, let's say, Exodus 2:11, which says, Exodus 2:11 says, that's not a Bible, that's a commentary. Hold on, let me switch my tab. Exodus 2:11 says, "In those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and observed their hard labor, and he saw, the Egyptian man attacking the Hebrews." So there's over half a millennium between God's conversation with Abram saying, "Your kids are going to come back to Canaan," and that moment when Moses says, "I have to do something about our situation here." And in that time, we are somewhere between the 15th century BC and the 12th century BC, depending on how you date the Exodus. And what an Exodus involves is a mass migration, an abandonment of a heritage of slavery, of movement into a nomadic lifestyle, a consummation of that movement into somebody else's land. And this marks the occasion of the 5 most fundamental works of the Hebrew Bible. They have to be reoriented. These people that are moving from Egypt to Canaan have to be reoriented in terms of the world around them, in terms of the beliefs with which they are going to be interacting, and the beliefs with which they need to be cemented. They are reoriented in terms of creation. They are reoriented they are given a new social code. They are given a new religious code. Now, in terms of creation, one thing that we're going to talk about by the end of class today, is the Pentateuch as writing versus an oral tradition that eventually got written down in some form or fashion. But creation was very dramatic in most of the understanding of the ancient Near Eastern world. And this goes a little in what we covered a couple of years ago in the Bronze Age Bible class. But this is the Egyptian Book of the Dead, chapter 17. This is written somewhere between the 16th and the 10th century BC. It's hard to date. It's got a wide range. I am the great God who came into being by himself. Who is he? The great God who came into being by himself is water. This is how Egyptians viewed, in one sense, the beginning of all things. He is Nun, the father of the gods. Another version, he is Ra. He who created his names, the Lord of the Ennead. Who is he? He is Ra, who created the names of the parts of his body. That is how the gods who follow him came into being. So the Egyptians, that's actually a pretty tame one, all things considered. But the Egyptians, they had this sense that, there are lots and lots of gods, that the entire world, as you know it, is just brimming with supernatural personality. The Nile is a deity, the sky is a deity, anything is a deity. And there will be some chief god, maybe Nun, sometimes called Ra, who is water, like primordial water. He is water, right? Or Ra is the sun. And you pick these objects in the universe with which to bestow with divine personality. That's not gonna fly. Genesis, the creation story of Genesis, God just does what he wants with the water, but he's not the water. He makes the lights appear. He is not the big ball of light in the sky. He makes it happen. There's commonality, a common understanding of, speaking things, naming things into being and in existence. But ultimately, the Israelites are told on the occasion of their exodus from Egypt to Canaan, you can't look around you and see what it is that you are supposed to worship. You have to imagine beyond that. You have to think above that. Everything that you can see, the stars, the greater and lesser lights that rule the day and the night, the things creeping along the ground, the seas and the land, these are things spoken into existence by someone greater. It is a step up And then you have really, really dramatic things like, I won't read you all of the Enuma Elish because it is really graphic. If this were a college classroom, I would probably read it to you. But Enuma Elish is the Babylonian creation myth. And the copy that I have for you is from the 12th century BC. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, the begetter, and mother Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body, no reed hut had yet been matted, no marshland had appeared, when no gods whatever had been brought into being, uncalled by name, their destinies undetermined, then it was that the gods were formed within them. They strove in single combat, locked in battle. The Lord spread out his net to enfold her, the evil wind which followed behind. He let loose in her face. When Tiamat opened her mouth to consume him, he drove in the evil wind that she not close her lips. As the fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended and her mouth was opened, blah, 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 blah. In the Babylonian creation myth, the mother of all the gods is not unlike in behavior the Greek titan Kronos, who has a bunch of kids and then just wants to eat and destroy them all. And this one heroic god, Apsu, says like, no, and he shoots the wind into her mouth like an arrow, and it goes into her and it bursts her open from the outside. And then he takes the parts of her and makes creation. It's real nasty. Okay? And this is the reason why it is nasty, is because ancient people saw in the world around them constant competition. Constant competition between the heat and the cold, the day and the night, the mist and the clear sky. All these things, they saw creation as at war. And they understood the things, the personification of all those things to be at war. Israel is told, there is no war. There is no fight. There is no drama. There was nothing. And God just said, let there be light. And there was light. I don't know if it made a popping sound. I'm not trying to add to the Word of God. I removed the popping sound from the suggested record. But it's so different than what everybody else was being told. In terms of social codes, it really wasn't that different. You know, part of the occasion of the Pentateuch was how you were supposed to live with other people. Part of Exodus that you read in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it's all, you know, what happens if you have an ox and he gores your neighbor? What happens if a woman is chosen as a wife and her husband doesn't give doesn't live up to her conjugal rights as a wife? What happens? How do you treat each other? How do you have a good community? You know, there are about 150 laws in the Pentateuch that pertain to how your community is supposed to function. And that's actually pretty normal. The cultural basis of the law is pretty strong. There's a little bit of Hittite legal literature. It's a lot like the Code of Hammurabi. There's notes of legal texts from northern Syria, and there's even like some elements of ancient Near Eastern diplomatic treaties. And just to give you some numbers, the Code of Hammurabi had 282 laws. It dates to the Middle Bronze Age, an age before Moses. Bronze Age Hittite legal texts, the Hittites that lived up in what's now Turkey. We have legal texts that add up to about 200 laws. for how your community should function. A Babylonian law that we call the Lipit Ishtar Code has 38 laws, and the law of Eshnunna, which is another Mesopotamian code, has 61. And again, the law of Moses has about 150 dictations of this is how you get along with your neighbor. This is how your community functions. What makes the law so big is that on top of a little between 100 and 200 social instructions, there are over 450 directions about how to interact with Yahweh. The law is so big, not because the community that it was designed to shape was especially complicated, but because humans interacting with a perfect God is very complicated. And if you don't think it should be, you're wrong. Because we are messed up creatures that make an inordinate different number of mistakes, and God is perfect. And the manufacturing of the bridge between that immense gap is tremendous and complicated and awkward. We who have the Son of God as our advocate have sure got it easy, because we are not tasked with manufacturing righteousness. It is His righteousness has been given to us as a gift. This total package of His good. But before that was on the table, you had to work it out on a daily basis. And there were over 450 instructions that the Israelites were given to prepare themselves for every day outside of Egypt. Every day of being in covenant with the Lord who is above the sun and above the rivers and above the seas and above the land and all the creatures upon it. To bridge that gap required a lot of attention. And even then, grace is fundamentally involved, because what can the blood of bulls and goats really satisfy for human sin, right? But this is the occasion of the Pentateuch, is the preparation of a people who have to leave behind being controlled by a pagan nation and live for a God who has His own expectations for them and is very different than the gods that they're leaving behind or the gods that are worshipped ahead of them. The Canaanites there were some people maybe in the south, like in the desert. There's some archaeological evidence of people in the south that had started to worship without idols in small pockets, but overall, you don't have to dig for very long in Canaan, in late Bronze Iron Age Canaan, to find deities, temples, little statues of gods in smiting poses, ready to strike you down because you didn't offer them because you didn't make a good deal with them, right? The occasion of the Pentateuch is the occasion of the preparation of the people who have to live differently. From the Canaanites and from the Egyptians, from the Mesopotamians. But the occasion of the Pentateuch also has a historical aspect, which is the collapse of the Bronze Age. One of the ways that we date the Pentateuch is there's this period of time in which both dates of the Exodus fit, in which the ancient Near Eastern world is just falling apart. How many of you have ever heard of the Amarna letters or the Amarna tablets? A couple of you. So, the Amarna tablets are an archaeological discovery. The Amarna tablets were found, I can't remember if they were found in Amarna, which was an Egyptian capital. But I don't remember where they were found. I apologize. But now in museums, they're just spread out all over the world. The Amarna tablets are a collection of 382 cuneiform tablets, like, the little cuneiform tablets with the chicken scratch writing on them, all sides. They are written in cuneiform, again, a style of writing, mostly in Akkadian. Canaanites spoke Akkadian as like an economic language. Of those 382 tablets, not all of them are published. They are written, all 382 are written over a period of no more than 30 years, sometime between 1400 BC and 1300 BC. So end of the 15th to the end of the 14th century, that 30 years is somewhere in that 100 years. And the Amarna tablets are correspondence between Canaanite and Amorite leaders, and especially the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. And one of the big common complaints in the Amarna letters is the activity of a group called the Habiru, or the Habiru. P or B, depends on how you translate. How many of you have ever heard of the Habiru or the Habiru before? Okay, I'm glad we have a fresh slate with this, because oftentimes people have started making this jump, not started, this has been going for decades, that Habiru or Habiru could sound a lot like Hebrew. Don't do that. Okay? The English verb for leading a group and the metal that we used to make our pencil tips out of look a lot alike too when they're written down, but they're not the same. So, the Habiru show that Egypt, and maybe even in the 15th century, is starting to lose its grip on Canaan. The Habiru are this group that, if you take full account of all their appearances in ancient literature in the Amarna period, they always appear as warriors, and they are employed by some palaces. They have leadership among the people of various cities, especially up in Syria. That's one reason not to equate them with the Hebrews. The map of them is wrong. The map of the Habiru is too big for where the Israelites are depicted as being in the Bible. They are especially known as charioteers in some contexts. Habiru are named as providing service to palaces and temples as slaves in certain contexts. But in Egypt, they are mentioned as prisoners of war. And it's possible, a lecture that I heard at a conference a couple of years ago probably made the best uniform theory of what Habiru means to date, and it has yet to be published, so this is free with your tuition. But they may have been like political upstarts, political refugees. They're loyal to someone that gets dethroned, and then they just go around making trouble like political rebels. This is happening. Their activity is all across Canaan at the beginning of New Kingdom Egypt, at the beginning of the New Kingdom of Egypt period, the Late Bronze Age. And Egypt is used to having control of Canaan. So they're starting to lose their grip. The activity of the Habiru shows that. And then on the other end of dating the Pentateuch is a document called the Merneptah Stele, which dates to about 1210 BC, 13th century. And the Merneptah Stele says, has the campaign of a pharaoh named Merneptah. He's the son of Ramses II, the last possible pharaoh of the Exodus. And he did a campaign into Canaan. And one of his lines is, Israel is laid waste. It's his grain. The way that Israel is depicted in hieroglyphics in the Merneptah Stele, it's not the hieroglyphic for a city, it's the hieroglyphic for just a people group. So, or for a region, it's just a people group. So the Merneptah stele shows that there is a people group in Israel that's already there, right? Moses has to write the Pentateuch before the Merneptah stele is written, but after the Hapiru and other forces have caused Egypt to start losing control of Canaan. In fact, in archaeology, the transition between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, what makes the difference is that the Egyptian Empire coming out of Africa and the Hittite Empire coming out of what's now Turkey shrink. We don't know why. That's argued about. Some people say economic collapse. Some people say climate change. Some people say that there's 24 different factors and everything's just happening at once. But when the Israelites are on the move, have you ever wondered why nobody else just comes in and really tries to stop them? Like, Egypt is a major political power. Where are all of Egypt's allies? Right? Fine. Egypt gets destroyed in the plagues and the Israelites are on the move. Why did no one just come down from the north and just bring the hammer down on them? They were too busy with the collapse of their cities. Except for over in like Babylon, way over in Mesopotamia, the entire late bronze world is on fire for reasons we are still trying to piece together. Everybody was too busy with their own junk to think about helping Egypt and stopping this group of people who's coming out of there and is only really going as far as Canaan. A hop, skip, and a jump over. Nobody cares. Nobody can afford to care. But the collapse of the Bronze Age is the historical occasion of the Pentateuch. These people are being reoriented on how they're supposed to live while everybody else is trying to maintain their way of life. And then, of course, they come into Canaan and they eventually make it their own. But the last thing I want to mention to you today is the significance of the Pentateuch as a written word. In the archaeologically oriented models of history that I have to deal with on a weekly basis, I am regularly frustrated by the fact that Western culture, because the truth is, in the West, oral history reigns supreme prior to European colonization. Okay? First Nations in Canada, Native Americans, Native South Americans, they told their stories by speaking. Okay? This is why so many tribes of First Nations and Native Americans are embracing linguistic studies of their native languages in college courses. It's because the stories that they have of their people were passed on orally in great and exacting detail and effort. As the Western world has embraced the study of an Eastern Bible, that model was just kind of transplanted. And one of the things that I regularly run up against is this idea that Moses could not have written the Pentateuch because in the late Bronze Age, the stories would have certainly been oral. Somebody had to come along later and write it down because the appreciation of writing, of sacred writing, storytelling about the things that the Israelites seemed to be telling stories about, it just wasn't up to snuff yet. I have two things that I would like to share with you this morning. First, and it's going to be hopefully rare that I have more in common with an ancient Sumerian pagan writer than I do, modern people, but today. I want to read to you from the context of Scripture. This is a multi-volume series containing all manner of texts. Egypt, Syrian, Mesopotamian, that are contemporaneous to biblical documents. There is a Sumerian story. Sumerian, okay? As in before the Assyrians, the Paleo-Assyrians came to be, before Hammurabi, okay? Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. And part of this story recapitulates how there used to be one language and how one of the gods seemed to think that that was a problem, but it also contains the Mesopotamian sentiment on the origin of writing. Okay? That day, the words of the Lord, it's one of their deities, seated on broken text, the seed of princes, a messer tree grown up singly, were difficult. The language of the gods was difficult, their meaning not to fathom, and his words being difficult, the envoy was unable to render them. So the god Enmerkar has a messenger that he wants to send off with a message, but the message is too complicated for the messenger. Since the envoy, his words being difficult, were unable to render them, the Lord of Kolob smoothed clay with the hand and set down the words on it in the manner of a tablet. Little cuneiform tablet is what's being pictured. I'm going to skip forward in the story to when the recipient of that tablet gets it. What is to me your master's words? What is to me what he said further? The messenger has shown up to the Lord of Aratta and has said everything that he could say by memory. And then the king asks, well, what else is part of the message? And that's when the messenger hands him the clay tablet. And this is the best part. I'm skipping ahead several lines. After thus he had been telling him, the Lord of Aratta took the envoy's piece of clay. The Lord of Aratta looked at the clay. The words were fierce words, were frowning. The Lord of Aratta kept looking at his piece of clay. Remember when James talks about not just taking a passing glance at the law of liberty like you're glancing in a mirror, but lingering on it, focusing on it. That same behavior is depicted in a Sumerian story, thousands of years before James. I love the moment where the king of Aratta is just scared of this piece of clay with God's words on it, his God's words, not ours. This is how the Pentateuch was perceived. You know, people talk about who could have been novel enough to make up the Bible, but the writer of sacred content in the ancient Near East was not seen as a novel author, he was seen as a messenger. The writer of sacred things was not seen as inventive. He was seen as faithful. Or ideally, he would be seen as faithful, right? And then in Egypt, there's a 12th century text. In Egypt, in ancient Egypt, the invention of writing is associated with the god Thoth, or Thoth. And in Papyrus Anastasi 5, which is now in the British Museum, there's a section, and this is 12th century, so it fits into the wider date. This is just one text. This sentiment could date earlier than the 12th century. But let me read this to you. Here we go. Come to me, Thoth, O noble ibis, because Thoth was, the ibis bird. O God who longs for Kmunu, O dispatch writer of the Ennead, the great one of Unu, come to me that you may give advice and make me skillful in your office. I'm going to skip down to the end of the section, line 255. how great are the things that Thoth has done. Then they shall come with their children to brand them with your profession, a calling good to the Lord of victory. Joyful is the one who has exercised it. Does that sound like a group of people who are obsessed with oral tradition? Having your children branded with the skill of writing, how good it is to be a scribe. And the older Mesopotamian story about how writing is this gift from the gods. Does that sound like a culture that is steeped in a preference for oral tradition? No. So when the Pentateuch appears, and Moses has been established by God with the miracles of the plagues, with the miracles of the judgments that he has rendered amongst the people of Israel, and he starts churning out this stuff. Israel is not looking at a really well-educated guy who can come up with a good story. They're looking at a guy who can transmit to them the words that God has to share. The Pentateuch, Moses is not seen as brilliant, he's seen as faithful. Moses is not seen as ingenious, he's seen as a messenger, as a prophet, as someone who can say what is way too long to just remember, right? So, there is no basis in the ancient Near East for simply assuming that the Pentateuch had to be written after Moses because oral tradition should have been more popular. That is not what the evidence suggests about the cultures of the time. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Along that line, I've heard the idea that the gospel writers wrote a certain number of decades after Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That there's some that explains the differences in the gospel. Could not the apostles have been writing things down? I mean, it's almost as if there's a disconnect there.
Yes. So for anybody that's listening online, the question was about how does this whole issue of oral versus written apply to the New Testament? And The Chosen, the pottery is terrible, and the use of metal is way overstated. However, one of the things that I love about The Chosen, and now also Matthew does not come across as the nerdy one. Matthew has the most poetic gospel, like maybe of all of them. So Matthew as nerd should be questioned too. But he is constantly he's depicted as constantly just pulling out this little notebook and just writing something down, right? There is a difference, I think, between this moment. I think what we're used to imagining in inspiration is that just no record exists, and whether it be John or Moses or David, somebody just kind of sits down at their desk in their quiet, well-lit room and just churns out a whole book. Probably not. These people were busy, and I'm not sure, while God did prevent the sandals of the Israelites from wearing out, we have no evidence that writer's cramp was not an issue, okay? So, this idea that they just churned it all out in a sitting. Inspiration, in my definition, is a document is inspired by God to be uniquely trustworthy. Okay? Now, when the uniquely trustworthy version of a story is composed, can be different than when somebody first writes something down about the elements of that story. The first time somebody writes something down about Jesus after his ministry does not have to be the entire Gospel of Mark, right? However, of the over more than a dozen accounts of Jesus' life, only 4 of them were arguably uniquely trustworthy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we call them today. And when it comes to, whatever was known about the creation of the world amongst the ancient Israelites, or the creation, or, what kind of person Moses was, or how the period of the judges worked, right? The very first things that are ever written down about them do not have to be the most trustworthy, inspired accounts that are ever written of them. It is by the evidence that we argue for a lack of gap or the presence of a gap between the inspired version and the ability to talk about the elements of the story, right? In the fact that it had already happened. But ultimately, in the context of the New Testament, the argument of people just writing way after the fact is actually eliminated in the argument of J.W. McGarvey, Evidences of Christianity. It's out of print now, but it's fully available as a text in the Internet Archive online. You can check it out. J.W. McGarvey, Evidences for Christianity. And he actually walks back from the 4th century to the 1st century, the reputation of the Gospels and the documents of the New Testament individually to show that there's not time for the stories of Jesus to date later than the 1st century. So it's actually not by the concept of oral versus written that the 1st century dates of the New Testament are achieved. It's that realistically the time does not exist for them to have been later in historical argument. Somebody wrote about the death of Moses, and it is possible that Moses wrote about his own death. It is also possible that the perfect version of Moses' life and law was produced after he died, and that everything that Moses himself wrote, which I think would account for the overwhelming content of the Pentateuch, was written by Moses. And then somebody, last week we talked about in Genesis, there's a passage about Esau's lineage being compared to a time when there was a king, right? So the perfect version seems to need to include the story of what happened to Esau. The perfect version may need to include whatever happened to Moses. How did he die? Joshua and Judges, I think, both cover Joshua's death. So there's what happened during the period of the infiltration and the Judges. And then there's when does the perfect version of that get written? Of course, the way that it operates in normal, and this will be the last thing I say, the way that it operates in normal scope, in normal academic discussion, belief is not a virtue. In normal academic discussion, disbelief is a virtue. So the question of something being later is not geared towards the interest of inspiration. It's geared towards, looking at how many people must have put it together later. But I'm pretty set on inspiration, so it's not a direction that I can follow. Any other questions? Bueller? God loves you. You're dismissed. Okay.